I found the house in late November, just as the first snow was beginning to dust the ridgelines of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a rental, nothing fancy, one of those old clapboard farmhouses that dot the Virginia highlands like forgotten tombstones, paint peeling in long gray strips, foundation settling unevenly so that the floors sloped toward the center like a funnel. The landlord was an older man who lived 2 valleys over, and he seemed almost relieved when I called about the listing, like he'd been waiting for someone desperate enough or naive enough to take it. The rent was cheap, impossibly cheap for a whole house, even one as worn down as this, and I needed cheap. I'd left a bad situation in Richmond, the kind you don't talk about in detail, and I needed distance more than I needed comfort. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained, perched on a hillside overlooking a narrow valley that filled with mist every evening like someone pouring milk into a bowl. The nearest neighbor was a half-mile down the mountain, an elderly woman I'd seen once hanging laundry in weather too cold for it to dry, and the nearest town, if you could call it that, was 15 minutes of winding roads through forest so thick the canopy blocked out the sun even at noon. It was isolated in a way that felt intentional, like the house had been built specifically to be forgotten. I moved in on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung so low you could barely see the tops of the trees, just me and a borrowed truck full of boxes that held everything I owned. The house groaned as I carried things inside, the floorboards complaining under weight, the walls settling with sounds like joints cracking, and the whole structure seemed to exhale cold air from gaps in the window frames and spaces between the baseboards and the floor. There was a parlor with a fireplace that didn't draw properly, a kitchen with appliances from the 70s, 2 bedrooms on the main floor, and a narrow staircase at the back of the hallway that led up to the attic. I didn't pay much attention to the attic at first. The landlord had mentioned it when he handed me the keys, said it was unfinished, just raw beams and old insulation, not suitable for storage because the roof leaked, and I should just leave it alone. He said it in a way that felt less like advice and more like a warning, but I was too tired and too grateful to have a place to sleep to ask questions. The attic had a single window, a small square of glass set into the gable end that faced the valley, and you could see it from the driveway when you pulled up to the house. Even on that first day, I noticed it looked fogged, condensation clouding the glass from the inside like someone had been breathing on it, and I remember thinking that was strange because the house was cold, not warm, and condensation usually meant heat meeting cold, not the other way around. I spent the first week settling in, unpacking boxes, trying to make the place feel less like a temporary stop and more like somewhere I could stay for a while. The isolation was harder than I'd expected. At night, the silence was so complete it felt oppressive, broken only by the wind moving through the trees and the house settling around me, groaning and creaking like something alive. I'd lie in bed and listen to the floors shift, the walls contract, the rafters settling, and I'd tell myself it was just the temperature changing, old wood responding to the cold, nothing more. It was on the 6th night, just as dusk was settling over the valley and the mist was beginning to rise, that I saw it for the first time. I was in the kitchen making coffee, staring out the window at nothing in particular, when I glanced up at the attic window. There was a shadow behind the glass. Tall and slender, standing just back from the window, the outline distinct against the fading light. It moved slowly, pacing from one side of the frame to the other, the motion deliberate and rhythmic, like someone walking back and forth in a small space, thinking, waiting. My first thought was that someone had gotten into the house, that I'd left a door unlocked or a window open, and some drifter or vagrant had climbed up there looking for shelter. But that didn't make sense. The only way into the attic was the staircase inside the house, and I would have heard the door open, would have heard footsteps on the stairs. The house was too old and too loud to hide that kind of movement. I stood there for a long moment, heart beginning to pound in a way that felt disproportionate to what I was seeing, and I watched the shadow move. It paused at the center of the window, facing outward, and I swear it turned slightly like it was looking down at me, even though I couldn't see a face, couldn't see features, just that dark silhouette against the pale fogged glass. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, my hands shaking more than they should have been, and I went to the stairs. The door to the attic was at the end of the hallway, painted white but yellowed with age, a simple latch holding it closed. I stood in front of it for a long time, listening, trying to hear any sound from above, but there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the faint creak of the house settling. I opened the door. The stairs were narrow and steep, more like a ladder than proper steps, and the air that came down was colder than it should have been, a damp, stale cold that smelled like old insulation and dust and something else I couldn't quite place. I climbed slowly, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness, each step groaning under my weight, and the temperature dropped with every foot I climbed. The attic was empty. Completely empty. Just exposed beams and sagging insulation and the peaked roof sloping down on either side. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, no footprints, no marks, nothing to indicate anyone had been up there in years. The window was fogged on the inside, beads of condensation running down the glass in slow trails, and when I reached out to touch it, the glass was ice cold, cold enough that my fingers went numb almost instantly. I stood there for a long time, sweeping the flashlight across the space, looking for any explanation, any sign of what I'd seen from outside, but there was nothing. Just emptiness and cold and that faint smell I couldn't identify, something organic and old, like wet leaves or earth that hadn't seen sun in decades. I went back downstairs and told myself I'd imagined it, that the angle of the light or the fog on the window had created a trick of perspective, some optical illusion that my tired brain had interpreted as a figure. But even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. I knew what I'd seen. I knew the shadow had been real, or at least as real as anything else in that house. It came back the next night, and the night after that. Every evening, just as the light was fading and the mist was rising from the valley, I'd see it in the attic window. Always the same. Tall, slender, pacing slowly from one side to the other, pausing occasionally to face the glass, the outline sharpening with each passing day like it was becoming more solid, more defined. I started to notice details I hadn't seen before. The way it moved with a slight hitch in its stride like a limp. The way it held its head tilted to one side like it was listening. The way it would pause directly above wherever I was standing in the house below, like it knew exactly where I was, like it was tracking my movements. I stopped going up to the attic. Stopped opening that door. I told myself it didn't matter what was up there, that as long as it stayed in the attic and I stayed downstairs, we could coexist in whatever strange arrangement this was. But the house didn't let me ignore it. The creaking got worse, more frequent, more deliberate. Footsteps, that's what they sounded like, slow and heavy, moving across the attic floor directly above my head, following me from room to room. When I sat in the kitchen, I'd hear them pacing above the kitchen. When I moved to the bedroom, they'd move to the space above the bedroom. Always overhead. Always watching. I started sleeping on the couch in the parlor, as far from the attic as I could get, but even there I could hear it. The boards creaking in sequence, the rhythm of footsteps, the sound of weight shifting from one foot to the other. And sometimes, late at night when the house was completely silent, I'd hear something else. A soft sound, almost like breathing, slow and measured, coming from the ceiling above me. One night I couldn't take it anymore. It was past midnight and I'd been lying on the couch for hours, listening to the footsteps pacing overhead, the sound so regular and so deliberate that it felt like a countdown, like something building toward a moment I couldn't see but could feel approaching. The footsteps stopped directly above me, right over the center of the couch where I lay, and they stayed there. Just stopped. No movement. No sound. Just presence. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to happen, for the ceiling to crack or for the footsteps to resume or for whatever was up there to finally come down. But nothing happened. Just waited. And I waited. And the silence stretched out between us like a thread pulled tight, ready to snap. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me on the couch and it on the floor above, both of us frozen, both of us listening. It might have been minutes. Might have been hours. Time felt strange in that house, elastic like the darkness was making it slower. But eventually, the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving away from the spot above me and back toward the window, and I heard them stop there at the window like it was resuming its watch. The next morning, I drove into town and asked around about the house. Nobody wanted to talk about it at first, the way people in small mountain towns don't talk about things that might make them sound crazy or superstitious, but eventually I found an old man sitting outside the feed store who was willing to tell me what he knew. He said the house had been empty for years before I rented it, that the last person who lived there had been a woman, alone, a widow or a spinster. He couldn't remember which, and that she died in the house. In the attic, he said. They'd found her weeks after it happened, after neighbors noticed her mail piling up and the smell starting to drift down the valley on warm days. He said she used to pace at night, that people who lived there before had heard her walking back and forth, like she was waiting for something that never came. He said some folks thought she was still up there, still pacing, still waiting. He said it in a way that made it clear he believed it, even if he didn't want to admit it out loud. I went back to the house that afternoon with a plan to seal the attic, to nail the door shut and pretend that whole part of the house didn't exist, but when I got to the hallway I couldn't make myself open the door. I stood there for a long time, my hand on the latch, listening to the silence on the other side, and I felt something I'd never felt before in that house. Not fear exactly. Something closer to sorrow. A deep, aching sadness that seemed to seep through the walls like cold air, settling in my chest like a weight. I didn't seal the door. I just left it closed and went about my life as best I could, avoiding the hallway, avoiding looking at the attic window from outside, trying to pretend that the footsteps overhead were just the house settling, just wood expanding and contracting with the temperature. But I knew better. I knew what was up there. I knew it was real. The shadow still appears in the window every night, regular as clockwork, pacing back and forth as the light fades and the mist rises from the valley. I don't look up at it anymore, but I know it's there. I can feel it watching. And at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I hear the footsteps overhead, slow and patient, moving in that same endless rhythm, back and forth like something trapped in a loop it can't escape. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I went back up there. If I climbed those stairs again and stood in that empty attic and spoke to the shadow, acknowledged it, let it know I could see it. Part of me thinks nothing would happen, that it would just keep pacing the way it always has, locked in whatever pattern keeps it here. But the other part, the part that remembers the way it stopped above me that night, the way it waited like it was deciding something, knows that acknowledging it would change things. Would give it permission to be more than just footsteps and shadows. Would let it cross whatever boundary keeps it confined to the attic. So I don't go up there. I leave it alone. And it leaves me alone mostly. We exist in this strange balance, the shadow in the attic and me down below, both of us trapped in our own ways, both of us waiting for something we can't name. The landlord called a few weeks ago to ask how I was settling in, and I almost told him the truth. Almost asked him if he knew about the woman who died up there, if he'd ever heard the footsteps, if he'd ever seen the shadow in the window. But I didn't, because I knew what he'd say. He'd tell me it was just the house settling, just tricks of light and old wood, and I'd have to pretend to believe him the way he was pretending to believe himself. Winter is deepening now, the snow piling up in the yard, the valley disappearing under white more nights than not, and the house feels colder than ever, like the walls are thinning, like whatever separates the living from the dead is wearing away with every passing day. The footsteps are louder now, clearer, and sometimes I think I can hear breathing again, that slow, measured sound coming from the ceiling, from the walls, from the corners of rooms where shadows gather. I tell myself I'll leave in the spring, that I'll pack up and find somewhere else, somewhere with neighbors close by and thin walls and noise enough to drown out the silence. But I know I won't, because the truth is I've gotten used to it. The shadow in the attic, the footsteps overhead, the presence that watches and waits. It's company in a way. Proof that I'm not alone, even if the company is something that shouldn't exist. And late at night, when I'm lying in the dark and I hear it pacing above me, I wonder if the woman who died up there felt the same way. If she spent her last days listening to something moving through the house, something that had been there before her and would be there after, and if she made peace with it the way I'm starting to. If she stopped fighting and just accepted that some places hold on to things, hold on to shadows and echoes and the weight of all the loneliness that's ever passed through them. The shadow is in the window now as I write this. I can see it from the corner of my eye, that tall, slender silhouette against the fogged glass, pacing slowly, endlessly, like it has for who knows how long. And I don't look up. I don't acknowledge it. I just keep my eyes on the page and my hands steady, and I try not to think about what will happen when I finally can't ignore it anymore. When the boundary between us finally wears away completely, and the footsteps that have been overhead for so long finally descend the stairs. Because they will, eventually. I know that now. It's just a matter of time. And when they do, I don't know if I'll run or if I'll just sit here and wait, the way the shadow has been waiting all this time. Patient. Watching. One floor above. Always on the verge of motion.